I don't care if this is your first year bass fishing or if you've been fishing for 57 years, fishing in a pond is one of the most fun times that you can have while fishing.
Come here. Come here. Oh my gosh. Are you kidding me?
And today I'm gonna break down springtime bass fishing in ponds. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. If you're looking to get a great deal on some of your favorite lures, I'm gonna leave some links down below for some of my favorite pond fishing baits and some baits that we're actually going to discuss today. So click those links down below in the description and you're greatly going to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now today I want to specifically break down springtime pond fishing, and to do that I'm going to break down the springtime into 3 different phases. You're going to have the pre-spawn, the spawn, and the post-spawn. Now when it comes to pre-spawn pond fishing, I break down a pond a lot like I do a bigger lake. What I really like to know is where have the fish been and where are they going? This is the same way I break down any really big lake. I look for wintering areas and I look for spawning grounds. Now in a pond, I do the same, although it's a little bit simpler. A lot of ponds, the wintering area is going to be the deepest part of that pond. You know, a lot of ponds across the nation are kind of bowl-shaped, they're kind of flatter, they're almost like mini natural lakes, and anywhere you have a hole or you have some deeper water, that is typically where the fish are going to winter. Now for every pond, this could be a little bit different. Some ponds are 15, 16, 20 foot deep, and some ponds, the deepest water you're going to find is about 6 foot deep. Here is the pond that I actually grew up on, and right here was the major wintering area in this pond. Now if you're fishing really early in this phase, you know, some of the bass actually still might be in that wintering area. They may be out in that deepest part of the pond. And so in order to fish for these fish, there's 2 techniques that I have always done that have caught me a lot of fish before. And one is a drop shot. You know, simply casting a drop shot out into the deepest part of the pond and really working it extremely slow across the bottom is how I've caught a lot of fish in the past. Now the reason that I like to use a drop shot is because a lot of ponds are pretty silty. Some of them have that grass or almost slime on the bottom of them. Those bass are gonna hug the bottom, but they don't always like to pick something off the bottom. So I go with a drop shot to catch those fish that are kind of in those holes out in the middle of the pond. Now another way that I love to catch those fish that are in those holes is actually with a jerkbait. Now if your pond is deep enough and it's clear enough and it only needs to be probably about 6 or 7 foot deep, you can catch a lot of fish with a jerkbait in those holes. Now the big thing with fishing the jerkbait is you're going to work it really, really slow. You're gonna cast it out, you're gonna reel it about 5 or 10 cranks to get that bait down, and then you're gonna pop that bait and then let it sit for about 5 seconds. You're gonna pop that bait and let it sit for about another 5 seconds. The big key here with that jerkbait is just keeping it off the bottom. And I will use a jerkbait even if that pond is 10 or 12 foot deep, because those fish will actually come up to get that jerkbait. Now there are some rare situations where you're going to be fishing a pond that is actually rocky, and in the deepest part of that lake it's actually rock. Now if you are fishing a rocky lake, you can almost never go wrong with a jig during the pre-spawn at any time. So we know where those bass are wintering. Now we got to talk about where these fish are actually going to spawn, because this is very important when it comes to the pre-spawn. Now in a lot of ponds across the nation, the major spawning grounds for the bass is simply in the shallow water, basically around the border of the pond. Now with that being said, there are going to be sections of a pond that bass really like to spawn in. It really just kind of depends on the bottom composition or the cover that is in that area. For example, if you look at these 3 areas right here, these 3 areas were where the majority of the bass spawned in my pond. Now we're going to get into the spawn in just a minute, but knowing where those bass winter and knowing where they spawn can really help you in that pre-spawn time frame. As the bass move from their wintering areas to their spawning grounds, they're always going to stop on little staging areas, just like they would in a big lake. Now in a big lake, a staging area can be a creek channel swing bank or a secondary point kind of leading into a pocket. When it comes to a pond, I'm simply going to draw a line in between the wintering area and that major spawning area, and somewhere along that path is typically where you're going going to find a staging area for the bass. Now, sometimes these staging areas could be brush piles. For instance, in this section of my pond, there was a small little brush pile that I had planted, and during the pre-spawn, I always caught a ton of fish actually throwing a jig in this brush pile. But for a lot of ponds, there's not a lot of structure in them. A lot of times they're fairly flat. So the staging area for a lot of these bass, a lot of times is just the water out in front of the spawning grounds. And more importantly, it's a depth thing. What I found growing up is that when bass would move up, they would kind of hang around this zone where basically the light penetration would stop. So from the pond that I fished, I could see down about 4 foot deep in this pond, and the bass would always hang out in the pre-spawn in kind of this 4 to 6 foot zone right in front of their spawning grounds. Now, you could use a number of different lures to catch these fish that are kind of just hanging out right outside their spawning ground. For instance, you could still use the drop shot or the jerk bait. Something that I like to do a lot was throw a big swim bait for these fish. And another thing was a lipless crankbait of some sort. A lot of times I would yo-yo a lipless crankbait in that 4 to 6 foot zone and catch a lot of fish in the pond. Now, if the bass are spawning around the entire perimeter of the pond, then you might have fish hanging around the entire perimeter of the pond in that zone where that light penetration stops. Now, the dirtier water, the shallower these bass are gonna hang. The cleaner the water, typically the little bit deeper they're going to hang. Now, typically the bass are gonna hang in this zone on sunny days, but on cloudy days, this is typically when you see the bass just kind of go up into the shallows, and a lot of times they are looking for kind of that last meal before they start the spawning process, because as they start spawning, both males and females are not going to eat a lot. So one of my absolute favorite ways to catch bass during that pre-spawn time frame is when you have cloudy days and you can go out there and throw a black and blue swim jig and just catch a ton of bass. Now, as the water starts to warm, you're gonna hit the spawn. Now, the spawn in a pond is very simple, right? Because most of the time, all you gotta do to find fish is walk around the perimeter of the pond and you're gonna see fish that are on beds. This is a great time to actually make a note of where the majority of bass are spawning so that it can help you to locate those fish during the pre-spawn in the next year. Now, if you wanna try bed fishing, it's actually one of my favorite things to do, and I've done it a lot in ponds, and there's really only 2 techniques that I'm gonna use. One is a wacky rig and one is a Texas rig. It's very, very simple. If I can visibly see that bass, most of the time I'm going to start with a Texas rig, and a lot of times I like to actually pitch that bait at that fish and actually kind of hit him in the head, hit him in the tail. You want to get that fish really upset where he starts spinning around and then he picks up that bait and swims off, and that's when you set the hook and get him. Now, if the fish is a little bit spooky, sometimes that's when I'm going to pick up that wacky rig. I'm going to make a long cast at a bass where I know exactly where it is sitting. I'm going to let that wacky rig fall and just sit in that bed and slowly move it. And a lot of times, if you're fishing from a distance, that bass will pick that bait up and start moving off. Now, after the spawn, you have the post spawn, and for the most part, post-spawn in ponds, I still stay extremely shallow. Now, the biggest thing that I really start to seek is cover. You know, in every single pond, there's some kind of cover. That could be cattails or different types of reeds. That could be lily pads. That could be lay down logs and brush piles. That could be rock. Now, the reason that I like to stay kind of shallow and fish around cover is right after the bass spawn, a lot of times in ponds, you're gonna have a bluegill spawn, and they are going to spawn in some of the similar areas where the bass spawned, but you also find them kind of everywhere on the bank, and they usually spawn in clusters, and a lot of times you're gonna have bass that hang around to actually eat those bluegills. This is kind of their time of the year to get revenge on the bluegills that were harassing them during the spawn. A lot of times if you can find some sort of cover near that bluegill bed, that is where that bass is going to hang out while it sits there and waits to pick off bluegill. For instance, in the pond that I grew up on, this section of reeds always had a few bluegill beds throughout it, and I could always flip these reeds with a Texas this rig and catch a lot of bass. This is also the time of the year where scum starts to form a lot on ponds, and you can use that topwater frog that we all love to actually drag it across that scum and catch some bass. For the most part, fishing in ponds is actually pretty similar to fishing in lakes, but it's just on a very smaller, sometimes simpler scale. So don't overcomplicate it at all. And if you guys actually want to watch another video about pond fishing, I did one where I pretty much summarized the 3 main things that I like to look for when I'm fishing ponds right here. So click on that video and watch that next. Also, don't forget to subscribe, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.